I'll say a little bit about the format of the event and just try to introduce it a little bit before we pause the recording to do a quick round of introductions, and then we'll start with our first speaker. So this community dialogue series has been started by our lab group and sustained for a couple of years now, where what we really try to do is facilitate and catalyze conversations between leaders, observers, members of online communities of different kinds, and folks doing research in that space. Our lab group is an interdisciplinary group working across a few different university institutions and contexts. And we do research largely about different kinds of online community organizations, including free and open source software communities that we'll be talking about today. And the goal here is just to have a thoughtful conversation, a candid conversation, sort of sparked by recent research that we think is relevant to community leaders and members as well as researchers. So I'm really excited. You just heard a brief introduction from Matt Gaughan, but Matt is going to talk a little bit about some new research that he's been doing. And I would just say that Matt, just to add to his introduction, is that he joined the lab a few years ago now, but came with an earlier degree in computer science and experience working as a software engineer. And I think what I find really exciting and compelling about his work is that he tries to sort of take that skill set and then also integrate it with, theoretically sophisticated and kind of grounded thinking about how organization and organizing processes in software engineering really work. So both being able to understand how the code really works and how the organizations really work. And I think that, you'll see some of that in what he's going to talk about. So with that, Matt, please take it away.
Yeah, great. I'm going to share my screen that everyone can see. Sweet. So hi, thank you, Aaron, for the introduction. My name is Matt Gaughan, and today I'll be talking about some work that I did with Kaylee Champion, Sohyun Huang, and Aaron on the introduction of README and contributing files in open source software development. This is work that was published earlier this year. And I want to start the presentation by starting with a few propositions. The first is that open source software projects require sustained contributions in order to be healthy, in order to be maintained, in order to kind of be well kept. This is kind of broadly accepted as a reality. But at the same time, a lot of project contributors might leave. It's an open source project. People can freely associate with the project and freely disassociate with the project, or they might just be taking a break. So that means that FLOSS projects really often need new contributors to join the project in order to keep this kind of maintenance of contributions, in order to keep a sustained level of people working on the project. And because this is a pretty wide phenomenon, a pretty wide need for projects, institutions like GitHub, Mozilla, and the Cloud Native Computing Foundation offer a lot of recommendations and guides on how projects, as organizations, can best act and intervene in order to recruit contributors to sustain their existence, to sustain their maintenance. And a lot of these guides take on different shapes, but one kind of common guide is the institutions will recommend the development of project documentation like README files or contributing guides. This is different than like technical documentation. So instead of talking about the details of a specific function or a specific technical subcomponent, instead these files are trying to provide that level of information and detail for project machinations or project details as an organization. For the rest of this presentation, I'm going to say documentation, which sometimes I think of as technical documentation, but in this case, I'm referring to like this project level documentation, so README files or contributing guides. If we take the recommendations of GitHub, Mozilla, CNCF, we might arrive at like an understanding of documentation, or at least an idealized understanding of documentation, as being focused on contributor collaboration, as being proactively developed, and as being pretty thorough. And we can see a more clear view of this when we look at the examples that are linked in these guides. So this is a README file that's linked in the Mozilla like guidance on how to create a good README. Um, and we can see in the example that the file is really well structured. It's very comprehensive. It talks about who we are, how to join. It's very kind of social in its recruitment of contributors. And we see something really similar when we look at Kubernetes, the contributing guide, which is linked in the CNCF literature. Um, and it's also very thorough. It's very comprehensive. It leads with communication. It leads with this kind of community-oriented, or at least collaboration-oriented framing of what it means to join the open source project. And these recommendations are motivated by a pretty rational grounding in prior empirical literature. Prior work shows that documentation is actually really important, or like this type of project documentation is very important for the recruitment and the solicitation of new contributors. Prospective contributors look for robust, well-structured, and comprehensive documentation when making the decision on what project they want to devote their time and labor to. And this is kind of shocking because a lot of documentation is like not very good. It's disorganized. It will say that a contribution process is one thing, and then in practice, the contribution process is something completely different. But even the bad documentation is still a useful tool for the recruitment of new contributors. And what the kind of institutional recommendations seem to miss is that project documentation is not something that is like fully formed and fully developed on the first go. It's something that needs to be kind of developed over time. There's a longitudinal construction of the file that gets it to being the well-structured artifact that prospective contributors look for. And while there's some empirical evidence into this evolution of documentation, there's almost no empirical research into like the genesis of it, of the moment when a project introduces a document or a file in a kind of intervention into the normal goings on. It adds something to the organizational structure of itself. And we think that this is really important, right? Because the first version often sets the path for subsequent versions. There's a path dependency that, every subsequent draft comes from the first draft. And we think that even the publication itself might be an important intervention in the goings on of the project organization. And so this rationale, this kind of identification of something where, we as researchers thought it was interesting, but there doesn't seem to be that much work looking at it. This was the motivation for an empirical study on the publication of document or of project documents. And we looked at the different we looked at document publications against some of these kind of common institutional recommendations, whether that's the recommendation that documentation should be thorough or reference or discuss contributor community, sorry, or even the recommendation that documentation is developed proactively. In order to look at this, I'm going to go briefly over our methods and data. There's a lot more details about what we did, about our data collection, about our filtering in the paper, but for everyone's sake, I won't kind of step through a model formalization right now. But we looked at open source projects that are packaged in Debian, and we did this in order to get a set of like widely used kind of important projects that are used in a range of Linux distros, but that are from a pretty broad range of producers. You have so many different ways of organizing those projects. There's no like one standard way of governing the project, which we thought was important for getting a good understanding of how different types of projects might all kind of use these artifacts in similar ways. So in the end, we got data for the introduction of 4,200 README files and 700 contributing guides. And for each one of these events, we got the first version of the documentation file. First version has a bit of an asterisk around it because, as anyone who has like written or started a blank repository before might know, you kind of write an empty README file and then two hours later you go back and you populate it with everything you've done in the intervening 2 hours. So we actually grabbed the first version after 1 week of the file initially being introduced. So hopefully this is kind of a more stable first version than the file that is changed 6 times in 4 hours or something, right when you publish it. And we also grab 12 months of weekly commit data, of weekly contribution data, so 6 months before, 6 months after, to kind of help give us an idea of the context within which a project decides to publish one of these documents. In order to look at the content of the document, we use a topic model, and then in order to look at the context of the document, we use the mixed effects regression model. And again, the details of like how we fit the regression of like what the parameters on the topic model were are all in the paper. So as you might imagine, the first version of the documents are actually quite short, even though institutional recommendation would suggest that they're thorough and kind of comprehensive. Here is a kernel density plot of the files in our data set, with the x-axis being word count and the y-axis is the density. You can see that like many of the files are just incredibly short, like 20-word readmes. Contributing docs are a little bit longer, but in general, like these are sparse, mostly empty files that are being published, and they're not being updated in the week between the initial publication and the and when we collected the data, right? Like it's the README docs that were short on the first publication are still short, when we collected the first version after a week. And what information is included also doesn't focus on the collaboration and community amongst contributors that are often that is recommended by GitHub and Mozilla. When we fit a topic model, we saw that README files primarily focus on installation instructions, and then to a lesser extent, configuration instructions, just getting the library on your machine, getting it to run. And contributing guides are kind of similarly functional or similarly kind of to the point where they focus primarily on step-by-step instructions of how to create a task, submit a PR, or write a bug request, or write a bug report. And everything else is really secondary to that kind of core topic. Finally, on the recommendation that documentation should be developed proactively, READMEs are published early, but contributing docs are largely published after an influx of activity. This is a moving average of the weekly commits in the weeks surrounding the document publication. README docs are published like within the first few weeks of a project's kind of creation. So there's a little bit of a grain of salt on some of the flat line or the flat zeros in the weeks so much before the README's publication. But contributing docs are published much later in the project lifecycle. And we really see that both types of documents are published after a sharp increase in weekly commits. And then by and large, the publication is followed by a pretty sharp decrease in weekly commits. So it's a local maximum of activity, which doesn't necessarily imply that these documents are published in anticipation of new contributors or in anticipation of any type of attention. But when we were thinking about this plot and we're thinking about the kind of on average decrease of weekly commits following a contributing documents publication, we were really curious about the cases in which projects actually experienced an increase in post-publication contributions. And so we asked the question, what types of documentation were followed by increased commits, specifically around our contributing guides, because of they're published later on in the life cycle. There's a little bit more analysis that you can do instead of the README docs who are published, in the weeks following the project creation. And to do that, we looked at the random effects coefficients from our mixed effects model. It's going to get a little wonky, but bear with me. On the y-axis, we have our random effects coefficients. We're using each line is the confidence interval for that estimate. On the x-axis is just project index. So each line is a project's is the coefficient of the impact of publishing a contribution guide on weekly commits. So higher is you get more publication or more commits following the publication of a contributing guide. Lower is less. Oh, so if the CI does not include zero, if it's entirely above zero, that means that those projects experienced a post-publication increase in commits. If zero is in the confidence interval, then that's essentially null because zero is in the confidence interval. And the group on the very bottom in the dark blue, that means that those projects experienced a post-publication decrease in commits following the introduction of their contributing guide. So what we were curious about is what the characteristics of the contributing guides that the green group published are, because following the publication of those guides, the projects got more week over week commits. They got more activity. They were able to sustain or in actually increase their level of contributions. So the characteristics of these guides, these are longer documents. They focus on contributing procedure, which is from the earlier slide, you might remember that most of the contributing contributing guides focused on contributing procedure, but these more so than the rest. And then also interesting is that these contributing guides in the lime green group focused a lot on code style. And this might make a little bit of sense if you're trying to solicit successful contributions. If you're telling the prospective contributors exactly the format that you want the code submitted in, that might make it easier to accept commits. That might make it easier to accept pull requests. Also, in comparison to the other groups of contributing guides, these ones did not focus on legal compliance, so not that much discussion around licenses or CLAs, even though that's increasingly kind of a part of contributing guides. So in summary, we found that projects often deviate from common recommendations when first publishing this kind of like first version file. They're often publishing short and empty documents. They're focused on really functional information around either installing the package, installing the library, getting it to run, or kind of step-by-step instructions on how to submit a contribution. And these files are often published following an influx of contribution activity, not necessarily in anticipation or kind of not necessarily proactively getting ready for such an influx of contributions. And then finally, we find that projects that publish longer kind of functional contributing guides experience more post-publication contributions. In conclusion, we think that these results indicate that projects don't really follow the institutional recommendations, even though you might imagine that like GitHub or Mozilla have a lot of impact on the organizational behavior of different open source projects. And kind of to needle in on a detail of our findings, we think that the publication of empty documents might indicate projects performing good hygiene or performing some sort of I don't know, good governance when they don't actually care about the underlying meat of the document, right? Like if you're publishing an empty README file, you don't necessarily care that much about what the contents of the README file can do for you. You care more about the fact that your repository in its main directory has a document that is readme.md. That is more meaningful to you than the contents of the README file. Where people might have gotten that idea is beyond me, but this is the GitHub community standards checklist in which publishing an empty README file, publishing an empty contributing guide will get a check mark next to that checkbox, and it'll mean that you're more adherent to recommended community standards, which might be incentivizing substandard behavior. Um, and so it seems that the recommendations might not be that useful for projects developing their first version publication. If projects are early on in their life cycle or kind of just starting out, maybe they don't need to create the most robust and comprehensive documentation just because there's not necessarily that much to be robust and comprehensive about, and project contributor hours are limited and constrained. This is kind of compounded by the fact that not all projects have the same goals all the time. Our study does a little bit of this imposition by evaluating week over week commits as an outcome. But the fact of the matter is that not all open source projects want increased commits. They certainly not all want external contributions. There are some projects that are perfectly happy being single author maintained, having somewhat irregular weekly commits, and that is true across projects. It's also true across different moments in the project lifecycle. And so some of the recommendations or some of the ideas that have come out of this is that maybe future work should spend more time thinking about kind of context-specific interventions and context-specific recommendations around some of these organizational decisions, because it seems that the general case kind of institutional recommendation seems to be there seems to be a lot of gap or distance between the general recommendation and how projects are actually using these files or how projects are starting to use these files. Um, there's a lot of different things in there. I think that like it leads well into Igor's talk after this about an intervention and about a context-specific governance thing. But thank you for listening to the presentation. I want to thank the open source contributors who made their work available, as well as funders. Here's my contact information. If you have any questions, please reach out, but also really happy to, get into the discussion after this. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much. All right, folks, welcome back to the Community Data Science of Community dialogue series. And for our second speaker today, we're really thrilled to have Professor Igor Steinmacher from Northern Arizona University joining us, where, as he said in his brief introduction before, he's an associate professor in the School of Informatics, Computing, and Cyber Systems. And I think that, we really were so excited that Igor could join, in part because I think the work that he's done and that he and his collaborators have done really exemplifies a strength that I think a lot of us in the Community Data Science Collective really admire, which is that it embraces this kind of both rigorous kind of great research practice alongside identifying questions and ways of pursuing questions that produce analyses that are highly relevant and highly applicable for communities. And that's a hard line to walk. I'll just ask folks who aren't in research worlds to take that one on. Take my word for it on that one. So we're really thrilled that Igor's here. Really excited to hear the conversation that his work provokes. And with that, I'll turn it over to you. Thanks, Igor.
Well, I'm the one that should be thanking you guys for inviting me for such like a great group that is here in this meeting. Oh, it's a great pleasure for me to talk a little bit about what I've been doing. It was hard for me to handpick whatever could be relevant here. I tried to just like move through some specific things that I did in the past and focus a little bit more on the governance side. That is the focus of this specific meeting that we're having. I'll try to bring some overview of what I did in the past and what I'm doing to these days. And it's good that you have Pedro here because Pedro is the student that is conducting part of this work, PhD student here with me. So it's a great pleasure again. So a little bit like, thank you for the introduction. I just want to have other people to know, it's like I'm originally from Brazil and I've been involved in open source since early 2000s. And actually, as part of communities in 2003, I was part of the organization of the Brazilian Forum on Open Source for 5, 6 years. So I lived in Porto Alegre for a while doing my master's, and it was really nice to get involved with these people. And since then, like my eyes were opened for open source. I worked in a governmental company in Brazil for 2, 3 years. And in the moment that we were discussing opening up all the projects there, and we made all state related projects open source, and they are still being used by several states. And we created a community of different companies of open source contributing to these single things like MVD for those who are from the US, like the transit vehicle department software is a big case in Brazil. because we developed for one state, for our state, and it was like implemented in a series of states. So I think this is a good example of the power of open source for public service, right? It's like you don't have like multiple states working on the very same solution. So there was again, like everything piled, going on top of each other. And I moved to a bank, and then open source was not a thing, developing for a bank. So I was a project manager, and I was not happy. So I came back to academia uh, in 2010. And since 2012, I started every single year, if not every semester, uh, teaching students on how to contribute to open source. And that became my main way of contributing for some time, trying to bring people in. Like I mentioned, I think at FOSS is like if 2%, 3% end up succeeding, it's a big win for me. So currently I have people who took classes with me, working for Red Hat, working in Brazilian open source companies, and which is a great like achievement. I say like 5 people who become big in open source is already something cool. And I've been researching onboarding, inclusion, and strategies more on the governance side since 2011. So it's been some time. I remember when I was writing these emails, like, oh my gosh, uh, I'm getting a little bit old now. Uh, okay, so I started there in 2010, like working with onboarding. I actually, after working with the bank, so I worked for HSBC for 6 years, and I was, as I said, a project manager, and I had my team distributed in 5 different countries. And all that boom of outsourcing and everything was when I was managing, and I felt the pain of the whole thing. It's like there was no environment like this that would just get together and have a video call. It was all like audio conference rooms that we had to book and go and connect to a IP. And so it was not as easy as it is these days. So when I moved back to academia, it's like, okay, this looks like something that is really affects open source as well. All the language barriers, time zone, etc. It's like, what about we take a look at this? And then I started looking at it, and I see that people onboarding were the ones like were really having a hard time. It's like pre-GitHub, it was like a complete like ad hoc kind of process taking place in other projects. So patches via email, patches via forum, patches on SourceForge, or whatever. So and then we started to take a look at this landscape, and we found out that the landscape was rough. So there was no single way of contributing. There was no map. There was no documentation at all how to contribute. GitHub came and sorted out a little bit things, and we tried just to take a look at that time, like 2013, 12. What if we just organize uh, whatever knowledge is out there? So mailing lists. Like sometimes, like uh, uh, developers and contributors just pointed people like read the history of the mailing list. Like how straightforward is that, right? So we tried to put this together, and we found out that by organizing uh, 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 the documentation, we could make the life of the onboarding people easier. Oh, I had like 3 semesters of students using, not using, just organized documentation, nothing new, nothing fancy. And we found out that people succeeded to contribute if the documentation was organized. Again, like pre-GitHub, pre-anything, and we found that people would feel more welcome and feel more comfortable in contributing. Uh, and on the other side, like of course, we do not want to overwhelm maintainers because these are like core pieces of open source. And I had some slides before this about sustainability, and Matt covered that. I just took it away because everybody's on board with that. Uh, and we started to take a look at maintainers' life as well. And we were a little bit like close to what Agwal did for a while, and we interviewed a few people, we observed a few people, and we figured out that maintainers are overloaded, whatever maintainers are. And in this very first study that we did, that was published in ICSI, I think 2019, we found out that they cover a bunch of bases. And technical is not the only thing. Their main goal is seeking for quality, and quality is not only related to the technical artifacts. So, and this became like another potential thing that we started to look at, like how can we help these people? Because if we unload maintainers, we may have more sustainable communities. So I started to experiment some tagging strategies, some ways of helping mentoring and etc. Nothing very fancy, uh, but at least like trying to put our hands to help people and see if some questions that they had could be answered. So just to give you an overview, like we try to take these two perspectives in whatever we do. Up to now, it's like it's not only helping people, but it became our helping communities to get people in. And we know that things happen, and Matt touched a really nice point that we are currently investigating. That is, developers take breaks, and especially in open source, that is not only a full-time people working, although like the landscape is changing more and more, uh, but breaks can impact projects pretty hard, and there is no way to know with the in project that are managed by volunteers or community-based kind of projects. We found out that people usually come back and usually they leave just letting one or two people know that they're leaving. And we noticed by analyzing some data from some projects that productivity goes down a little bit and it comes back after the person is back. So it impacts a little bit in terms of, for example, if the person is really core, code review and the amount of code that is merged goes a little bit down, but again, we were looking at some projects. We are now interested in understanding like what are the risks. So we're talking about people leaving and coming back. What if someone disappears? We talk a lot about this truck factor thing. That what's the number of people that need to be hit by a truck so the project dies, right? What if are actually hit by a truck? Right? What will happen with the project? What are the big issues? Like, what are the holes that we'll have in the projects? So we are starting to try to analyze this. Like, we'll need more people specifically for with these skills or this skill set or to review, to code, whatever. So this is one thing that is ongoing after this research was published, and it's taken a little bit too long, just because, as we all here think, no, open source is really rough and there is no one size fits all kind of a thing. So we are trying to understand what are the patterns out there and if we can have like ad hoc solutions or if there are actually specific niches that we can target. Well, like given all this context, I want to focus a little bit on what is the topic of today, that is more like interventions and governance. Uh, as part of our sustainability endeavor, we had a community that was hosted somehow by one of the professors that worked with me. So one of the core contributors worked with me, and we got some funding to help with this community. So data table was syncing at some point. Data table, for those, I'll come back to this. For those who don't know, is an R package used for data analytics. So it's used by big companies and focuses more on memory and better use of computational resources. And behind the scenes was one core maintainer playing the benevolent dictator role. And this person was like not getting funded by this project and was starting to work in a different company that would not allow him to put the same effort. And all the responsibilities were on his shoulders. And the community started to grow because like data analysis started to become something so all at the same time, and the project was collapsing. We will see that in numbers pretty soon. And this led us to help this community. try to understand what was going on, and try to rebuild a sustainable and health community. All of this is reported in a paper. So we had this really interesting case study, and the case study was about governance. So how governance was played a role in changing the landscape here. What we found out for starting, like by analyzing what was going on, was they have people struggling to participate because uh, there was no one to support. Although there were other core members trying to get the thing running, the throughput was not enough. So the backlog of issues and pull requests was going nuts. There were language barriers. Uh, this thing, data table, is used in multiple countries, in health industry, in finance, and etc. And not all the developers are pretty comfortable with English. Uh, and all the documentation was in English. Our background on how to help maintainers and how to help onboarding played a role here on helping them how to make the thing work. We understood that we needed to change the way that the project was working in terms of organizational infrastructure and in terms of capacity building. So what we did was we looked at the numbers first. And I would like you to take a look just at the numbers before this dotted line here. This is where data table was in terms of backlog of pull requests. So it sounds like the number of pull requests waiting for review was going like crazy all of a sudden. Uh, because again, like more people were joining, but there was not enough people to review and merge the things. And it was this one person who had the right to merge all the pull requests. So before we started anything, we get a hold of the maintainer here, and we got a hold of the other main contributors, and we made like explicit call for a formal governance document. So this was an issue in the issue tracker. Toby was the one professor who worked with me here. That was a core contributor of this project, still is. And we started these discussions like, we need to do something. Before that, it's important to notice, like Pedro is here and he will remember, there were like 2 or 3 issues. Like, is this project really alive? It's like, what's going on here? Nothing new is happening. My issues are stuck there. So people are starting to poke the community. And this call for action really made a difference. So as you can see, like we had like a benevolent dictator for life kind of governance. And the problem is that the benevolent dictator will have a lot on their shoulders. What about we change it? We have this money to help building something to help, and what should we do? And the discussion was pretty nice. I think like 10, 15 people got involved in discussing and coming up what were the needs and how to make these changes in the governance model. And they ended up with a starting version of the governance that is currently under discussion again after we conducted some work here. So we took a look at the data after like 1.5 years, is that right, Pedro? It's like after 18 months of the implementation of this, we took a look at the data before and after, and we conducted a survey with the contributors. So we had 17 people answering the survey. It may sound like a small number, but the total number of contributors here needs to be taken into account. In the previous the 12 months before this survey was conducted, I think we had 30 contributors committing to this repository. So the response rate was over 50%, which gives us a nice idea. And this enabled us to understand like what is going right, what is going wrong. So not only we put the governance model in place and try to see how it goes, but we collected feedback and we are working on making it evolve. So this is the general feedback that we got from the developers. One thing to notice is the high number of people that do not agree or disagree. Most of the questions were like, did this thing improve after the governance model was implemented? Okay. So nor I not agree or disagree when we talk to people is like, I didn't see too much difference. Uh, so, but what matters to us is the number of people affected on the positive end. So we see that for almost all the constructs that we analyzed here, half of the respondents felt that it positively affected the community. Some highlights here are the roles definition. Of course, there was like a benevolent dictator and nothing else. So nobody knew who were committers, reviewers, whatever. Clearly defining that gave like a north to people. And also, how do you become a committer? How do you become a reviewer? All these things are put in place and make a nice impact in the community. And the general satisfaction with the new governance model is a big plus here. As you can see, like 11 out of the 15 people thought that there is impact, and a really old school person from the community is like on the fence. We are working to understand what can be done to make these few people, all these answers that you see negative here were by two people. It's not spread across all the population. So it's two respondents who were on the negative side. So we are going in depth in that to understand what happened here. Okay. So overall, like well received. And if we look at the numbers, so we did not constrain ourselves to talking to people. We wanted to see like what was the real impact. That's one thing that we usually do in our research. We do not keep ourselves like in the numbers. We like to hear from people, like both sides can tell lies. So when we see something interesting in one side, we want to take a look at from the other perspective, just to see what's actually going on. So we also conducted some historical analysis here. And this is the graphic that I showed you before, this one on the top left. Uh, as you can see, the backlog of pull requests was going like up and up right after we introduced that new governance model and we brought the community together again. These numbers started to decline. And it's important to notice that decline means we are merging or rejecting more pull requests that are coming in. Okay, so it's not only like we could control, but we also brought the backlog down. Uh, it's important to acknowledge here that yes, there was one person that was paid by the project during 6 months. So the initial 6 months we had someone. This person was mostly involved in development. He was not involved in code review, so he was not a reviewer or someone with rights to commit. And the core maintainer role was quickly taken by someone else that is currently a Google developer that was part of the project but contributing minimally. When the chance came to become something that would have a say in the project and work with other people, and the guy became like all of a sudden someone big. So he's the core contributor now. He's the maintainer, lead maintainer. So it allowed us to have someone else taking up the lead of the project because like now we have well-defined roles and we can see like how to get to these roles. And the person like followed the steps and got to that role. Now we have a few maintainers, a few reviewers, and it's going well. Other things that it can do is the number of new people uh, making pull requests. So this is like a person that appeared for the first time in a pull request since the beginning of the project. Oh, meaning that how many people are showing their faces for the first time. And again, like you see like one, twos and zeros here before, and after we had some more people coming up and showing up, mainly because these maintainers that started to appear started to grab people from their social networks and bring into the project, which was pretty nice and make the project like healthier. And another, like this can be a little bit misleading. I'll anticipate the bottom right one. The mean age of the issues in the project. Of course, like the age will start to grow from when the issue is open. So of course, the ones that are older were opened like way back in time. Okay, but the thing to observe here is not this decline. This decline can be misleading. Again, like the newer one will be younger than the older ones, of course, because this is what we are looking at. But the thing to look at here is that the things that are getting opened in the last 2 years are not staying too long open. So it means like not only pull requests are going from the beginning to the end, but also the issues. Uh, and Okay, given these nice results that we had, we wanted to understand, like Pedro came with questions like, what about other projects that came up with governance? Because it's easy enough to take a look at this project. We know what was done. We know that there was a big push. We know that we brought people in. What about other projects? How did that work for in the wild, right? And he's like, what about we try to get the same thing that Matt did with contributing and readmes? Let's go there and see if we find uh, these governance files and see how they are structured. And we took a look just to understand first, what are they saying in this governance? Was not a thumbs up, but okay. What are they what are they saying in these governance files? Like we wanted to see if are they like touching the same topics? Because we went through the literature and blog posts and whatever, trying to find if there are guidelines. And there are two guidelines I think that are fairly reasonable in terms of what is governance for open source. But there is a huge literature on governance for software projects. And when we looked at this governance for software projects, it's like, this doesn't apply at all. They're talking about mostly on the hierarchy of a company and how the responsibilities of each department and everything play a role. And that's not what we need. So we started to look at other places and we found like almost nothing. It's desert. Again, like there is a book, I think, from IBM. There is something from Red Hat and something else. I don't remember. Do you remember, Pedro? I don't remember. What was the other one? Other resource that we found?
One from GitHub.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, GitHub, like just teaching what should be in a governance.md file. Uh, and like looking at what we did and trying to understand if other projects are doing that, like we wanted to understand, like, are they also mapping the hierarchy here? Are they also mapping roles and responsibilities? How to step up, step down from to a role, how decisions are made, and etc. So all the things that we try to analyze here that were our goals, like we wanted to see like how other people are doing this and if they're touching something else. Okay, so sampling is always tricky and it's never enough. So in this case, we wanted to see actual software projects and licensed software projects because this is an issue. If you go in the wild on GitHub, you can get whatever, right? If you go and I'll look at repositories. Okay, I have my courses in repositories. Maybe someone is analyzing my courses as software repositories and they are not. So we specifically focused on software projects, starting by filtering them according to licenses. So we got the top 10 licenses for open source, filtered out all the projects, 12 licenses, sorry, and we got like the 1,000 most starred projects per license. So coming up to 12,000 projects. Ended up that out of these 12,000 projects, only 68 had formal governance files on their repos. And out of the 68, we analyzed the content. And as you mentioned as well, Matt, like in our case, 17 of them were just like, or a link or a placeholder. Oh, this is a governance file, whatever. So I know that GitHub forces people to say like, oh, please create this file, please create this file. And maybe this is what's going on here as well. And then we started to try to figure out what these governance files were covering. We first started like, let's try to do something automated, because we can go from this set of files that we have to a much bigger set of files, because we know another research group that is dealing with governance and they had more files than we do, because they went and collected files for a year. And we found that it was impossible because the language was pretty different. And the first finding that we have related to this is that the way communities define roles is far from standard. So they have different names for the same role and different roles for the same names. So that was the first thing that came up, and we said, oh, let's just stop doing whatever now. Let's just focus on the roles, because I think this is kind of interesting. How are the projects defining this, the hierarchy and the structure of their people? Uh, and in line with that, we found that all the files that we got had this organizational structure somehow, had these roles defined. So, okay, that's fine, that's interesting, and everybody's doing that, which was not true for the other things. And how did you get to these numbers? This was a manual analysis. So we saw that it was impossible to do anything automated. We manually tagged each of the files. It was not a huge number of files, but this thing of different roles doing different, same role doing different things and same things done by different roles was something that caught us. And we sat together in 3 people for so many hours trying to organize this mess that was like impossible to simply try to put roles in buckets, that we had to come with at least a two-dimensional kind of thing. And we started mapping how roles map to skills. So we got a skill set from another open source project, open source study that analyzed the skills of people in open source to try to understand like what skills are covered by each of these roles in each of the projects that we have. Okay, and even by doing this, there was like a handful of roles that we were like, I don't know how to classify that. As people would put in the governance files like whoever contributes meaningfully to the project. Okay, maybe internally that makes sense, but not for us, right? So it was kind of a tricky thing to do, but we ended up doing something interesting. We tried even to get these skills mapped to whatever were in the files and try again to cluster to see like what are the roles that match the skills that we have and that we can automatically use. And we failed again. Was not possible even this after this first round. It was easy enough for us to find gaps in skills, but it was not very successful to cluster projects according to the roles and skills mapped to the roles. Okay, back to manual analysis and discussion. So this is one of, I think this was the last meeting, right, Pedro? This was the, so we tried to see like how things match. And we started going like role by role, project by project, and so these skills, these skills. And this is where things came out, how things came out. So we started to see like, what are the definitions? What are the expectations? And what are the community practices? So we could match what was going on here. So it was like a contextual kind of analysis for each project and each role. And this is a little bit of the results that we got to. You can see like we try to come up with names that are the most common ones or the ones that are established in multiple sources that we know of. So these are the most common kinds of roles that we found in the governance files. Maintainer is on purpose in the middle here. Some projects, the maintainer is like, uh, uh, I don't know how they do the job. As the maintainer was doing like everything. I was like contributors, users, and maintainer. What does maintainer do? Everything. It's like from advocacy to code review to marketing, everything. So the closer the things are, and when you see like some intersections here, it means that in some cases, maintainer are also playing this role. So maintainer is playing a role, the reviewer role, playing the role of a community manager, advocate. And when you see dots here, it seems that there is a relationship between this, and sometimes they share a function. Oh, it means like some projects call a committee member someone who has some roles of a maintainer. Right? So, and we try to kind of layer this out. So we found that clearly there were some roles that were purely organizational. It's like there's nothing technical. They're just like committed to the health of the community, more like on the community building side, and some that are more on operational level, that is more like technical roles. Uh, Things that we found trying to cross-relate skills and the names of the roles is that there is a drift between what we found and practice. What is our analysis was expected to say and practice. Oh, as you can see, like I on purpose like grayed out some of them. And see like contributor, maintainer, owner, steering, and some specific roles here. They are distributed throughout the thing, meaning that different projects will have different skills associated with them. To get a little bit out of maintainer, because we'll talk about maintainer, what some projects called steering member incredibly touches like management, interpersonal skills, but also talks about contributing tasks and technical skills. It can be that the steering member is expected to be someone contributing, reviewing, or doing something technically. Uh, in other cases, for example, the owner is someone who is expected to manage the project, but again, like we found skills all spread all across the board here. And the interesting piece here, if we go a little bit more in depth, is what we call the maintainer paradox. It's like that maintainer does all the jobs. If we get like, as I said, like there are projects that I don't know how these people do their work, and not negligible or small projects, like projects with hundreds of contributors, and the maintainer is doing everything. Uh, and when I read that, I want to believe we didn't check as well, do as I say, not as I do. We didn't check that, but if they do everything, I don't know what else they do. Because they travel to conferences, they are advocates, they do marketing, they do community building. So it's a bunch of full-time jobs at one. And when you look at this, you can clearly see that all these skills here are kind of why the maintainer is central here and touching having all these relationships. The numbers here are impressive. Uh, Thinking that we have 50, 55, 52 projects, we see like 48 that find that they need to have interpersonal skills, which is fine. But when you go here and 35 technical, 20 talk about working styles, like how you should work. 29 talk about management. So it's really spread all across the board, and there is no way we can say like, oh, this is how open source communities organize themselves, because there is no standard. And I understand why. I understand that some of them are under foundations that may impose some stuff and may have like a higher level thing. Some of them are really something that is coming up from from the community. But one thing that we started to notice is that a few of them are just like getting templates of governance models, and the similarity is pretty high. So this is one thing that I want to look at. So we worked on these roles and we want to take a look at the rest of the things, but this is becoming so interesting that we want to dig deeper in this role thing and understanding, like, is this really in place? Are people really doing that? Even like one thing that was mentioned in Matt's again, like, how often is this updated? Who is updating? Are there discussions related to this? As a governance model that is static, I don't know. It may be a really bad smell. Like, is there something defined like 5 years ago, still in place the same way these days? Uh, and yeah, that's pretty much what I have to talk about the big intervention that I've done and how we are proceeding with the next steps.